As you know, Eliade flirted with soil nationalism, with folk peasant Christianity. He was not a die-hard Christian. He was a more ecumenical. That's what his major contribution. You know, he was one of the founders of a discipline called the History of Religions, and he was the first chair in the University of Chicago. His title was Professor of Religious Studies. Okay, and after this, in the United States, they had these labels. Before they didn't have. So he was a more ecumenical person who wanted to bring all religions together somehow. And I will explain why he tried to do it. And here is my, again, explanation why Eliade introduced this expression shamanism as a generic expression, and why he did it, and why he wrote his book about shamanism. Okay. Because, as you know, he was not an expert in shamanism at all. His field was Oriental mythology. In the French edition and in the American edition of his book, in introduction, he makes a statement that I do not want to view shamans as neurotics. And it was this big contribution. That's what later attracted New Age people. So he wanted to accept spiritual practitioners, shamans, as they are. He views them as cultural heroes, as mystics. And in this case, he moves away from Eurocentric view. In introduction to his shamanism book, he says the spirituality grounded in stone, in a tree, in wild nature is not less valid than higher spirituality. Okay. And that's what again attracted later nature, New Age people. So in this book he expands the expression shamanism to South America, which never was used. Australia never was used by anthropologists as far as Australia, and even pre-Christian Europe. And here, not much, but a little bit, he kind of makes a notion that European witches probably could be shamans too, but he didn't extend it yet. So I will mention who extended it later, who labeled European witches as shamans. And he also makes a statement in his book, and during this, before my lecture with Professor Amayun, we talked about it, and he reminded me about this expression. In the introduction to his book, in his diary in 1946, an introduction to this book, Shamanism, he writes that I want my book to be read not by academics, but by poets, musicians, artists. And that was the message. The message of the book was the message for people in humanities and culture, intellectuals, who are interested in archaic spirituality. That's how he calls shamanism. And the word archaic is very popular. If you read the book, you will see it's archaic, archaic here, archaic there. So it was one of his favorite expressions. And again, in a few minutes, I will explain why he probably, in my view, used this word, and why he needed this book about shamanism. Because the plan to write this book came to his mind some 1945, 1946. So, not an expert in shamanism, so that's what I would like us to remember. Okay. Yet decided to write the book. Okay. This is the key. This is the key. So I argued that one of the reasons why he wanted to write his book about shamanism is because he wanted to identify so-called the most archaic, the most ancient patterns of religion, proto-history. with patterns of religion that go beyond Confucianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. As you know, that he was an expert in Hinduism, considered himself an expert in Hinduism and Buddhism, but in his book on shamanism, he wants to go beyond these religions. And so his assumption was that there was something, the most ancient, that goes beyond the most ancient religions. There's some generic blueprints for all of us as human beings. And that is why Eliade became interested in Carl Jung's theory of archetypes. Because Carl Jung, from a psychological viewpoint, he argued the same thing. See, Eliade was coming from the history of religion. Jung was coming from psychology. And that's how they met each other. In fact, they were part of the same Eranos conferences in Switzerland. They were coming each year since 1946 to 1957 something. Each year there were Eranos conferences in Switzerland where these people who are interested in archetypes were meeting each other. Joseph Campbell, Mircea Eliade, Carl Jung, and Archaic Techniques, but I'm not sure yet. I think he did come there too a few times. Let me draw attention to his dissertation on yoga. I didn't notice this before, so I don't write about this in my book, The Beauty of the Primitive, but later when I was reading his diaries and when I looked through his dissertation, I said to myself, oh, here it is. So that's where it started. In 1933, he defended his PhD dissertation in Romania, where he tried to trace the origin of yoga. And he argues again that yoga is something that the most archaic, that goes beyond Hinduism, that was created in some kind of the most ancient text. Okay, so there was already this notion, idea or desire to identify as something that goes beyond Hinduism. Okay, most ancient spiritual tradition. But again, why did it happen? Where does it come from? This desire to identify these so-called most archaic patterns of religion. And that's where ideology comes to the picture, in my view. Okay. We know that in France, actually, there was a book, I forgot the name of the author, published about Eliade called Forgotten Fascism. Biography of Charan, Eliade, and Ionescu. There's three friends. I forgot the name. So she argues that Eliade... Yeah. Yeah. And she argues that Eliade was associated with fascism, and it's correct to some extent, but the picture was more complicated. Okay. And that's where we need to bring up this ideology. You know that in the 1920s, 1930s, among European intellectuals, especially on the right, there was this popular movement of traditionalism in Romania, in Hungary, in Italy, Julius Evola, okay, in Germany, of course. Okay. And Eliade was part of this movement, traditionalism. Okay. So they lamented, they cursed capitalism. Capitalism was bad. Modernity was bad. Okay. So we need to go to traditional culture. We need to defend traditional culture. Soil, spirituality. It's not defense of Christianity. No. And they were against organized religion, by the way, traditionalists. In France, René Guénon, just you probably know this, was the kind of example of this approach. See, René Guénon eventually goes to Egypt and being interested in Islam, embraces Islam. Okay. Julius Evola, Italian traditionalist, becomes interested in Buddhism and writes books about Buddhism, where he also argues that Buddhism is one of the most archaic religions. That is why it's better than Christianity. It's devoid of Judeo-Christian tradition. Because Judeo-Christian tradition, it's something that it's like, it's modernity, it's progress. And that is why it's bad for us, because it brought to our world the idea of history, the idea of progress. But Eliade has a bigger plan, so he said, I'm not going to stop. Here it's Islam, Buddhism. I'm going beyond. I'm going to see what we can find in the most ancient text. Okay. You might be interested in this Evola, Italian traditionalism. The reason I decided to draw it to your attention because the title of his book is very revealing. It shows us what they wanted. Revolt against the modern world. Okay. Revolt against capitalism and all this, modernity in general, not necessarily capitalism. And of course, Mircea Eliade was a person who definitely was on the right, on the right side of the political spectrum. But look what happens in 1960s, 1970s. And yesterday we talked about it, remember? In 1960s, 1970s, we have counterculture in Western countries, United States on the rise. And now a lot of people on the left, they bring the same notions of traditional culture. That modernity is bad, modernity disrupts, progress is bad, reason is bad. So the tremendous interest in tribal people. So the same ideas that, or similar ideas that had been promoted by people on the right, now were increasingly promoted by people on the left. And you probably know that, I don't know about France, but in the United States, people who are in New Age and nature spiritualists, they're mostly the people predominantly who, politically, they are people on the left. Okay? And that is why, again, my argument that's why Eliade becomes popular. So basically a soil right-wing person now suddenly becomes popular among the left. So they embrace his book, New Age people. And suddenly he becomes multiculturalist because now he is in demand on the left, because his critique of Western civilization, modernity, and that's what each of his books. If you look through his books, you will see that the myth of eternal return. Okay, his generic history of religion. So in all these works, you will find this critique of modernity. Okay, which resonates well with the New Age people. And of course we have Carlos Castaneda, who in early 1980s picks up this metaphor, includes in his books, and then it becomes popular. So not sorcerers anymore, but shamans. So in his books in 1980s, early 1980s, and early 1990s, we see the word shamanism instead of sorcerer, because sorcerer is something dumb. You cannot use it anymore. So before the 1960s, we have medicine men, medicine women, jugglers, witch doctors, magicians, wizards, which had this kind of negative, some of them have negative notions. But after the 1960s, more and more we have shamans. What is the attraction? Those people in nature communities who read Eliade's book, they of course became attracted to this. Because for them, a shaman was the word that was not European, it was non-Western, indigenous, and it was gender neutral. But I did find some interesting attempts to kind of move away from the word shaman. Some people who do not languages, I met a website, some feminists who worship goddess and goddess religion, mother goddess. They said we have to purge the word shaman because it's a man. It goes back to the word man because the root of the word is man. Because they don't know the Siberian origin of the word. And one of these feminists, she offered. She said maybe we want to do shamanka, and another said no, but it has the word man. So we have to get rid of this. So they're still debating. And I remember I even sent them a message. I said, just look into this linguistic origin of this word. It has nothing to do with man. It's a Siberian word. It comes from Evenki language. So those who know about this, who read books about shamanism, they knew it's a gender neutral, and that's what makes it very attractive to them. Okay. So you don't need to use this method, especially in the American nature communities, among American New Age. You don't need to use these expressions, medicine man, medicine woman. Okay, it's hardly used right now. And of course, let me draw attention to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, 1960s to 1990s. We have this profound distrust of Western civilization. We have the decline of positivism and the rise of postmodernism. What again, the message of postmodernism? Don't take for granted so-called positive science. And that's what Eliade kind of makes a hint. So I don't want to accept this positive science. I want to accept religion as it is. I'm not going to rationalize religion. See, that's a major attraction for the New Age people. And of course, we have the rise of multiculturalism or multiculture, as Germans say, that this revelation of non-Western spirituality, tribal spirituality, idealization of non-Western wisdom, pre-Christian wisdom, the rise of environmentalism. There's natural things that come to the picture and become very important to our minds. Tribal people, like Native Americans, Siberians, indigenous Africans, were viewed as stewards of the nature, who take care of the nature. So you know the story. And of course, by the end of the last century, it reached this grotesque proportions where people introduced this idealization of non-Western spirituality in our culture, and it becomes like a fetish for me. So you cannot even question this. Such a profound wisdom, you have to take it for granted. And that's when such people like Michael Harner come to the picture. You know that simultaneous things were going on in Hinduism and Buddhism. So people were bringing Hinduism to Western countries. People were bringing Buddhism. Dalai Lama begins to travel in Western countries. And the same thing is going on in shamanism. Okay? So Michael Harner is the first person. Right now we have hundreds of them. But he was among the first to spearhead this teaching shamanism. So he drops anthropology profession, gets out of the university and begins to teach so-called core shamanism. He became attracted to this notion that we have to find some skeleton of shamanism, generic blueprint of shamanism. Okay? And I'm going to teach this. I'm going to identify it, I'm going to teach it. So that is why he labeled it the core shamanism. Okay? A reason that I think it became attractive to Westerners, especially to Americans, because he also has this profound message of individualism. So there's a certain skeleton, but on the skeleton you can put a lot of your own meat, so it's your own notion. So you can make up, you can imagine, you can make up your own rituals. There's a certain core things, but details might come up from everywhere. You shop around for your spirituality everywhere. So gradually, slowly, again, see this expression, shamanism, and the whole host of notions come to Western culture. And that's when we come to witches, okay? Michael Harner, it's a less known work, the role of hallucinogenic plants in European witchcraft. There was a book collection of articles published in 1973 by Oxford University Press, by the way, called Hallucinogens and Shamanism. So Michael Harner published this article where he labeled European witches as shamans. These were the first shamans. But later Christianity suppressed them, and that's how smeared them with dirt. And that's how we have this negative view of witches. This article drew attention of Carl Ginsberg, another interesting scholar, historian, UCLA in California, published a book called Ecstasy, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, where he picks up this article by Michael Harner, and he did the research of so-called benandanti. Benandanti, it's in Italian folklore, these witches who come to protect the crops, right? Peasant crops. Yeah. So he said these were the first shamans, but later Christian Church invented a bunch of negative labels for them. Okay. So they were marginalized. But if we decipher this Italian folklore, we will find that these were the shamans, original shamans. Okay. And again, my argument is that because of this book, we have already a bunch of New Age publications where I picked up this idea. Oh, here's the scholar who said this. So we are going to label all witches as shamans. These were the first shamans. Because you need some kind of... and that's how you have this whole host of books right now. So just hundreds of them. See, Tolkien, Homer, a link to shamanism, shamanic Christianity. So people trying to identify this peasant, folk Christianity, and they labeled as shamans, so which goes against this organized church. Okay. Or what we have, Nordic shamanism, where so-called attempt to identify Nordic spirituality as Nordic shamanism. Okay. Celtic shamanism. In fact, there are about 35 books on Celtic shamans. This is one of them. Okay. Shamanic Wicca. Dozens of books on. At the same time, in 1990s, right now, currently, we have a critique of Eliade and Michael Harner. I call it a friendly critique, okay, which is explained by this postmodern view of the world, okay. The argument, and to some extent Michael Harner himself agrees with this, you know, and he said my core shamanism doesn't go against this. The criticism is that local spiritualities are so different, we cannot generalize like Eliade or you, Michael Harner, so there's so many differences. So we need to talk about shamanisms, or it's better for us maybe to use local versions. So let's identify what Nordic people had for shamanism, what Celtic people had for shamanism,